So the title of our discussion is the term documentary is as vague as never before. We will discuss how mixed genres in documentary filmmaking, such as docudrama, mocumentary, hybrid, affect today's film industry, and we'll hear about the most cutting-edge virtual reality and augmented reality projects of today. And we'll discuss the questions of the genre. To begin this conversation, I'd like to reference a bit some of the films and names in the history of cinema to remind us all that this question has been discussed for as long as cinema exists, really. You know, we made this title is as vague as never before to bring you all here, to make it sound like it's now or never, but really this question is ancient. And for example, Robert Flaherty, he was known for his technique of asking people to recreate scenes for him, and his famous hunting film in Nanook of the North. He asked people to actually do the old-style hunting that they didn't already do in reality for the film specifically. His latest film, the Louisiana Story in 1948, is all based on the script. It is a written film, but the people of Louisiana play in the scenes. So, and that's the classic of the documentary film, right? Robert Flaherty. And so actually his last film is, like we can call it docu-fiction. Then there's a quote from Jean-Luc Godard to inspire us all today. All great fictional films tend towards documentary, just as all great documentaries tend towards fiction. Then when the classic of the cinema verite, direct cinema Fred Weisman, was asked in a very recent interview about the genre, how he would call this genre that he's working in, how important the pure verite is to him, his answer was, and I'm quoting, "Well, this is all just bullshit. I make movies, and there's a great word for this, movie." So on the one hand, we can see that it's been discussed as long as cinema exists. On the other hand, there are some of the new technologies and things that appear every day that questions that we are going to be discussing today, you know, they're probably going to be obsolete by the time we finish discussing them. So, and personally why I wanted to make this roundtable on this subject, because I think when we think about the genre, we think about the form and art, which is the most interesting and wonderful thing to me in what we're all doing. So I'm glad to present our speakers today. Thank you all for coming, and welcome. John, I want to thank DCTV for having us today. This is my favorite documentary castle in New York, and John is a dear filmmaker, dear friend and filmmaker. And I would like to start with Lynn Sachs, who is, I'm so happy to present Lynn to you. Lynn makes films, installations, performances, and web projects. Lynn also co-edited their 2009 Millennium Film Journal issue on experiments in documentary. Her films have screened in New York Film Festival, Sundance, Toronto's Images Festival, MoMA, and many other places. In 2014, Lynn received the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in Film and Video. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Oh, well. I am really happy to be here. I am just so excited to be sitting right here next to John because I took my first video class ever here in this building, and it actually is appropriate.
It's my fault.
Yeah, and this was in the early 80s. And I had just moved here to New York. I had a liberal arts degree, and that I had never taken a film class in my life, but I kind of discovered very alternative filmmaking when I was living in Paris for a year in school, and I came to New York thinking, oh, I'm just going to learn immediately, and I had disastrous experience working as a production assistant all over New York. I actually had to work on a Coca-Cola commercial and a Marine Corps commercial, and I felt very, very discouraged till I landed here. And it's actually really, this occurred to me right now because I learned to edit video, 3/4 inch decks, all of that. But I made this hybrid piece it was just the beginning for me on that. And I didn't even, of course, know the word hybrid, but I had shot some video in Ubud, Bali, and it was kind of a documentary about women who collected small stones with their children around to use to make cement. And so I saw that, that was the very first time I'd ever used a video camera, and I was there on a trip with my father and sister. And I looked at the material, it made me think about dance. So I thought, maybe there's something I could do with this documentary work that's also going to involve choreography. So I actually got some I met some Indonesian people, and they did dance, and we created this live multimedia piece upstairs here, where we had the monitor and we rolled it around as if it were dancing. And that's just amazing that I'm back here and talking about that so long ago. So I'm happy to be here. All right, that's all I'm going to say right now.
Yeah?
Yep.
So I am happy to introduce Kira Benzing. And Kira is a storyteller in crossing the mediums of theater, improvisation, documentary, fiction, and virtual reality. Kira's VR project, Cardboard City, debuted at Sundance. Then her interactive installation for Cardboard City premiered at New York Film Festival at Lincoln Center. And currently Kira is developing her first multiplayer VR game on gentrification that I actually was working with Kira on the pilot for this as an editor. So I'm happy to have you, Kira, here with us today.
Yes, we started tackling editing in 360, which is a very new form. I don't think anyone has any answers yet.
Would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Yeah, so the game has some 360 video. 360 video VR is up for debate. That's probably its own separate conversation. I think it has to do with perspective and immersion and the kind of story you're telling. But I came to VR having initially trained in theater. I studied at Lambda, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. I thought I was going to be a classical actor, making a career doing Shakespeare and Greek tragedy. And I fell into documentary filmmaking from there. So I never took a film class. I should probably do that.
Not necessarily.
I never took a filmmaking class.
Overrated. Yeah.
And then I fell into doc filmmaking. That's been an interesting journey. I started making a feature about an outsider scientist. That propelled me into making all these films about artists. And then from there, I discovered virtual reality. And basically, because of The Outsider Scientist, I was writing this treatment for this immersive 3D nonlinear experience. And I was writing, I'm going to put people in goggles or glasses. They're going to see this perspective and have these choices. And that's like back in 2011, and everyone thought I must have been mad. And then I put on a VR headset, and I realized this is the technology that I've been writing for. And that's the field I need to be in. So it took really my theater background and my understanding of space and time and bringing characters together and working in a place with, where does your audience fit into that story? And then taking my sort of guerrilla filmmaking, DIY, documentary style and mixing all that together. And for me, that is my journey into VR.
And thank you, Kira. And then our next speaker today is Cindy Klein. Cindy is known for her two personal documentary feature films, Andre Gregory, Before and After Dinner, and a portrait of her renowned theater director husband, and Phyllis and Harold, an intense probe of her parents' disastrous 59-year marriage. Cindy's films have been exhibited in San Francisco, Boston, Vancouver, Doc Leipzig, Montreal festivals, and many others. Were shown in theaters and museums, including Film Forum, Lincoln Center, Anthology Film Archives, Art Center in France and Britain. Her work was broadcast on PBS. She has taught filmmaking at Boston College, Harvard University, and when Cindy came to School of Visual Arts, I was very inspired by her work. Great to have you today, Cindy, with us.
So I guess by way of introduction, before I made those two long-form documentaries that Olga just mentioned, I was I came to filmmaking as an artist. I was a painter and did a lot of still photography when I was, from the time I was 8 on. Became an artist at that early age, I think, to escape a horrific family life. If you can see Phyllis and Harold, you'll see what I mean. So art making became my way of, I kind of chose that rather than doing drugs, or doing drugs as a profession. So I started, I went to museum school when I was in my early 20s. I was majoring in still photography, but I had a boyfriend who had a little Bolex 16 millimeter camera, and he lent it to me and taught me how to use it. And from the second I started shooting with it, I just became incredibly enamored with making the pictures move. And then I became obsessed and used that camera to make my first 16 millimeter film called Dinosaur. So I made really art films and videos. And in the days of video art, I would have these videos in all these different festivals. We don't call it video art anymore, and then I kind of morphed into these longer form documentaries, not because I really wanted to make documentaries, but because I always have been a storyteller and wanted to tell stories, and the true stories were much more interesting to me than fictionalizing the stories, and so the films kind of grew into these longer feature-length things. And now, just recently, I've gone back in the past few years to much more of my early art film making things, and I'm going to show you guys the first 5 minutes of a brand new film that's actually just being really finished. This is it's color corrected, but the master sound is not on it. It's a short film. It's 14 minutes, and it's also an immersive installation that one person can enter at a time, and the film happens all around you on many screens and the ceiling and in windows, and there's an 8-channel kind of spatialized soundtrack. So it's really an immersion, very much, and that idea came out of some experience I've had with learning about 360 and VR, but without having the equipment, without wanting to actually make VR. So it's like a way of making an immersive thing happen, but the old-fashioned way with hands-on film and projectors, video and projectors and stuff.
Jeremy is an Emmy Award-nominated filmmaker. He creates documentaries for theaters, television, museums, and the web. His films that played at Doc NYC, Tribeca, Sundance, were broadcast on PBS, CNN, and I saw Jeremy's film Woody's Order at Tribeca this year, and it was a documentary based on a play. And I was really moved by this piece. And I was, I thought there was a very interesting theater and documentary mix. So, welcome, Jeremy.
Hello. Thank you. I would have liked to have been here today, but to one up the panel on my cutting-edge filmmaking techniques, I'm actually a hologram. So, anywho. I guess when I was a kid, I read comic books, and I would watch with my dad political talk shows, like the McLaughlin Group and Meet the Press, and that informed my sort of creative upbringing, that I wanted to do something that had people yelling at each other about politics, and also do it in a way that had stories and frames that I was enjoying from comic books. And my first foray into documentary filmmaking, I went with a bunch of friends to what we thought was an abortion clinic in Dix Hills, and it turned out to be a pro-life, help center. And as we're filming on one of these old Panasonic PV535, video cameras, we put the VHS tape in, you can see our realization that we were not where we thought we were. And I just kind of held that with me as I went to school. I also am not a film school guy, and studied Shakespeare and Chaucer and storytellers. And then when I got out, I started making films with two of my partners, Dan and Seth, who had been doing PBS docs. And I kind of bring to the table a non-traditional, kind of creative, more narrative film approach to stuff. And when we're making documentaries, because they're being seen at film festivals where you're seeing narratives, or they're showing up in theaters where non-docs play, or on Netflix where you have choices of narratives or documentaries. It's almost been the natural progression that documentaries should be crafted in a similar way that sort of speaks to that audience. So that's what I try and bring to the table with our productions. But
Thank you, Jeremy.
thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jeremy. John, I would like to introduce you. Everybody knows who John is probably, but I still will tell that John has 15 Emmy Awards, has been twice nominated for the Oscars, and is the co-director of this documentary, Castle, where we're in today. And John, I will be really curious to see your reactions today on what we're discussing and your opinions. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank everybody for coming. I'm quite familiar with some of the panel members and honored to be amongst them, and going to be happy to learn about the ones that I don't. I'm completely agnostic about form, about how films are consumed. We started out showing our stuff on the sidewalk. I didn't go to film school. The empty sidewalk was a very brutal teacher. And our early films were really brutal. And so, in the rare cases where they actually stayed around to watch, that we tried to figure out what it was that they liked and to sort of move in that direction. Made hour-long documentaries for PBS because that was the only size slot that they would take. And then we got blacklisted, so we had to learn how to make 3 and 4 minute things for the Today Show and try to communicate the same thing in a shorter timepiece. Tuesday, the documentary division of the Academy, the executive committee, is meeting. And one of the things that they're discussing, and they're meeting here at DCTV, are 2 films this year that we have to decide whether they're going to be eligible to participate as real documentaries in the Oscar competition. The question is the episodic nature of serials, and if a program seems to have been made for television, but they somehow or other chopped the documentary out of the middle of it and presented it like the OJ film last year, which won. It has everybody in the documentary division in a tizzy. And so does Errol Morris's film, which not only is also a serial, but has recreations, and not just generic recreations, but recreations with A-list Hollywood actors, with the production values that we're all talking about here. We'll see at the end of Tuesday if these 2 films move forward or get chopped out.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see. And Lucy Castellanets, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Don't worry. Don't worry. I'm really happy to introduce to you all Lucy Castellanets. Lucy worked as an art administrator and as the Deputy Director of Communication and Visual Arts at the New York State Council on the Arts. Lucy made 2 feature films, Sonia and We Don't Want to Make You Dance. Lucy also worked with the Robert Flaherty Film Seminar, serving on their board of trustees. Lucy, while I don't think you were here yet, when I was beginning, I was talking about Flaherty's films and how he was, asking people to recreate the scenes for the films, or very, for the Nanook of the North and their Louisiana story.
You're asking who to do that?
We have two trained actors here, Shakespearean actors, and they're going to act out any part. You name the part, and they have to do it.
I was just referencing the film history of how we think sometimes that it's a very new thing, but it's as old as
Robert Flaherty.
cinema.
They always think of him as the first documentarian, but he thinks of himself as a potent storyteller, we would say. Yeah. I'm just so actually thrilled to be sitting next to John, because we have all this history.
Who did NISCA fund? They funded DCTV.
I mean, and DCTV, I thought, of course the question I would love to get into, Olga, and you're the one that can answer this. I mean, I know this is not the purpose of this, but, what is the future of Russian documentary filmmaking? Maybe at some point we could get into it. But I wanted to sort of bring this up in line with what we were doing in the 70s. Where John played a big part, and I was at the.
I was only 6 years old.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And all of a sudden there's the porta pack, and everyone can pick up a camera, and it was cheap, and everyone could be a filmmaker. But of course you had to have equipment and skills. You still have to learn the craft, right? And so John's DCTV was one of our we would fund these media centers where anyone could walk in the door, and they were all over the state. And of course, John was really the forerunner of all of this. Anyone can walk in the door and learn, have the equipment, and learn to make films. And therefore, you have this great multiplicity of voices. It's a way a democratic society should function. That everyone can speak. I think in the 70s in Russia, you had to be in a studio. You had 35 millimeter. I don't know whether 16 millimeter ever came to Russia. I'm not sure. No, not really. Yeah, but that was a very exciting time. And DCTV was at the very, very front of it, and still is, I think, yeah.
Upstairs, there's lots of kids.
Yeah,
if you guys want to walk through,
lots of kids,
it's something that really gives us a lot of energy, especially
Yeah.
when mean and evil people kick us in the teeth.
Yeah. Okay. I worked at the Arts Council. I was a bureaucrat. And I left there in 81, and I said, my turn. And I started making films, and I love the idea of handcrafting, and I love Super 8, though of course I took courses in 16 and eventually learned on the job, and I also took a lot of classes and so on. And eventually I made my 2 features. Sonia it premiered at the New York Jewish Film Festival in 2007. It was shown here in 2004. And then We Don't Want to Make You Dance, it premiered at Doc New York City in 2013, and we could talk about. The distributions environment that I encountered in each of those years was so completely different, and that's sort of something we can maybe go into. It's just a world of difference. From the old time, you find the distributor and you hand it over, and they'll do everything for you. No. For sure, that never happened. I went with that time. I went with Cinema Guild for my film and for Sonia, and but with We Don't Want to Make You Dance and a distributor. Am I getting too far over into? Okay.
Continue.
Okay. A distributor actually saw it before I got it out there and said, "Well, we'll just take it." And I said, "Well, how long do you want to know where to find it?" And he said, "Well, when you go, you use your festivals to promote it. Once it's on, once it's in our system." And I said, "Oh no, I'm find it." And so I went the more traditional route initially, but then I found out there was a festival in Spain that had their own platform, and they took it. And and Rain Dance in London had their own platform, and they took it. And then I found there was a nice niche, thing that I thought would be really nice for this film about a band that never made it, about a filmmaker that no one's heard of, and I thought that this would be, a really good. But they unfortunately, they gave me a great rollout and everything. But unfortunately, it was a small operation. So now I'm using distributor. Have you heard? Anyone here has heard about distribubbr? I see you on all the platforms, and I was wondering.
I'm familiar with it. I haven't.
Yeah, but they can, it'll soon be on iTunes. But they're like the middleman. So you don't go to a distributor. They're like a middleman who will get you on. Of course, you have to pay them a fee, but they'll handle all the mechanics of it, and then you're up there forever. I'm going to start out on iTunes. It could go to Hulu. It could go to Amazon Prime. I want to see how it works with this. But so it's a whole nother way.
The question that comes out of our question of their new forms and everything.
Well, how do these independent? I'm all into independent voices.
Right.
That was my, and how do we get out there and but of course you still have to break through somehow. You have to break through the noise, and through festivals and reviews and all that kind of thing. Probably other people have innovative ideas how to do that. Okay.
Thank you, Lucy.
All right. Okay.
And Kira, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your projects, and I know you brought something to show.
Absolutely.
So you have both made, your Cardboard City project consists both of augmented reality and virtual reality components, right?
And a makerspace.
And so you can explain the difference between everything to us.
Sure. So for Cardboard City, it started off as a little 360 VR film, however you want to describe it, on whatever mood you feel like, 360 VR. I think of it 360 like if I show it to you on the iPad, and because it's 360 content, if you move the iPad around, you're going to see it in a format we call Magic Window. So you're able to take it and see all these pieces, and maybe you feel like you're kind of inside the experience, but I think you feel more like you're inside the experience when you're watching it in a Google Cardboard.
So you will be able to see it after the discussion is over. Kira brought us some stuff to show more.
Some gadgets to help aid the experience. It is certainly, I think 360 content, it is dependent a little bit on this extra tool. Like, we still need a device to see it on. And if we're distributing, and who knows what that landscape is for VR right now, but okay, YouTube, Facebook, they have these options to play 360 video. Obviously, we all have a mobile device and we can watch it that way. But your experience with the content changes based on the perspective and how you put it inside each mechanism, each extra gadget. So if we put it inside a Google Cardboard, we're now overlapping and we're changing your perspective. We're faking 3D, still not 3D content, it's 2D content, but we're faking it so your brain thinks it's more three-dimensional. And the way that you look at it, because your senses are more blocked and your sight lines are blocked, you're inside this little Google Cardboard, I do think it shifts the way that you react and relate to the content. So your experience as an audience member changes. And most people describe it as feeling like they're inside the experience. So it's the same piece of content, but when watched on an iPad or on your computer, if you're spinning the environment around, you'll have a different relationship to it than when you're actually inside a Google Cardboard or a Gear VR or an Oculus Rift. Same thing happens, I think, when you go inside a Gear VR. Now we're shutting out even more natural light around you. So and if we put headphones on you now, and the sound is spatialized, we're working with 3D audio, which you would understand, Cindy. Mm-hmm. It's even more immersive, and you may feel even a greater sense of presence. And then I think that changes even further if the experience is created in 3D, in a 3D form, where you have 6 degrees of freedom. You can walk through that experience and make choices, but the content has to be created that way first. So I didn't start with that. I wanted to make content that was three-dimensional. It's harder. So I started off with making 2D content with a 360 camera. We documented this artist space. There were 300 artists that were being evicted from their studios in Gowanus. So it started off with this space. I think of it as a story about space, and it starts that you're just inside your space and it's coming to life in stop motion animation around you. And then I wanted to cast that wider. I really wanted to film many stories in 360. But at that time, it took a very long time to stitch and to film, and the cameras like to overheat. It was like a very unnatural way to make a documentary. So by the time I went back to interview the artists, they'd all been evicted. They were gone. So I had to rely on 2D archives. And what I did was I took them and I put them into the format that I really wanted to play with, which was nonlinear. And so I put them into this AR installation. And the clip that we can show you is the creation of us building these cardboard walls that we brought into Lincoln Center. And then you'll see a little bit of people interacting with the content. You won't quite get the perspective because it's hard. We shot it in 360. So it's going to display in an equirectangular format, which looks a little funny.
So it's a 360 experience of the
experience.
Of the experience that people were having during your installation.
Yes. So I don't know if you saw kind of like to the 2/3 of the frame to the right, there was this maker space that people, the prompt was, make a building for a future city that you want to live in. And when I proposed this whole installation to Lincoln Center, and they were like, okay, we really want the VR, the AR, this piece kept growing, I said, I really want to do a makerspace where people imagine this future city, and they use something tactile. We're doing all this new emerging technology, but let's do something with our hands. And I was really worried that people wouldn't engage with it. I thought maybe we'd only have like two people that were artistic and liked crafts and would make a building. And to my amazement, I don't know if you could kind of see it on that table, we actually ran out of space on the first day. I had to take buildings home with me. We had so many people made buildings, and they spent a really long time interacting with it. I started to record stories about the kinds of buildings that they were making. And another goal of mine in a future version of this installation is to do photogrammetry on site, where we take the buildings that people have made and photogram them, we turn them into 3D objects, and then I can put that in VR that they can then experience on a human scale.
So that they can look at their buildings that they built in the glasses?
In the glasses.
And go in them, right?
And go
They won't be able
inside?
to go in them, but they would, because then we'd need the interior of the 3D model made.
right.
But we'd have the exterior made, and they could
Right.
see it in like a real human scale.
So their installation that you had at Lincoln Center had the VR that people could watch in the glasses.
Yeah.
It had the iPad that they could. Can you just explain a little bit
So
how
the
it
AR,
worked?
yeah, so the AR that we did was basically, it was like a 20-minute documentary in a non-linear format. And each piece was different based on the length that it needed to be. So some pieces of content were 30 seconds and some were 2 minutes. And they were these glimpses of stories of people in Gowanus that had been evicted, were related to the art scene or related to the activist scene. And like how the pieces of story of how they tried to preserve these buildings for the artists, and what was happening to them as they were getting pushed out, and where they were going to go next. And so I took, there was a couple, Jess Dickinson and Mark Handelman, they're incredible studio artists, professional, successful studio artists who couldn't maintain their studio space. And I thought, this is a real concern. How do we maintain an art scene, an active art scene in New York, if our professional, successful artists can't maintain the studio space here? Where will they make their art? So at the least I can do is document it in 360. But since I couldn't get to them in time, I took these archives that they had and I put them into these documentaries. And the goal of the story was that you could enter the story in any point, and you would each have a different experience from how you interacted with the content, but you'd always get the same arc of story. And I was, watching how people engaged with it, and to my amazement, people came, they all seemed to have, they got the arc of the story, even though it wasn't done in a traditional beat-by-beat way. There was no linear structure, but whether they engaged with a VR piece or some of the AR story or the makerspace, they all seemed to understand what was going on, and that was my goal.
Thank you, Kira. Cynthia, I wanted to ask you about your installation, and can we see your piece? Can you talk a little bit more about what it was and how you came up with this idea, having done documentaries and features in the past?
So what you'll see is this 5 minutes of the film. So I knew I wanted to. How best to? Okay, so I went a couple of Junes ago to something you might know called. It was a symposium about VR and 360 film. It's in a place in Montreal that it's called SAT, Science and Arts Technologies, and they have a whole building for sort of artists and research and. Doing all this stuff, something you'd be really interested in if you don't know about it. I'll tell you more later. A friend of mine runs it. It was kind of built for him. He was a filmmaker who I actually made a film with when I was at MIT in the film video department many years ago, Luc Corchen. And I went to this thing, and they have this dome in the building, and I think they said it's the most perfect sort of visual and acoustic dome space in the world, aside from a couple of different planetariums. So it's as if you were entering a planetarium. It's 300 feet across in diameter. It's this incredible space, and they were showing all this 360 work in it. And I was completely blown away by one thing out of 50 that I saw, and most of the content was incredibly boring and sort of like walking into a disco with electronic music, because what it was that the tech people were making the work, because the tech people were sort of developing. So anyway, I just felt like, oh my God, in the hands of artists, this is amazing, because it was so immersive. And the thing that really worked for me was a piece where it made you feel, when you were standing in the middle of this dome, like you were on a boat in what looked like Venice but made of lace. And they had stitched together this whole, it was very elaborate, I can't tell you at all technically how they did it, but it made me feel, standing still, like I was actually moving through these sort of canals with buildings and it blew my mind. I was like touching myself going, oh my God, wait, is the floor moving, am I moving? I just was so taken with it. And then I wanted to, I learned a lot at that thing about VR, about, saw the cameras, but it was too unwieldy for me and too technical for me, because I kind of hate all the technical stuff, except when I have to learn it as a vehicle to making my work. So anyway, it was a little overwhelming. There isn't really yet, although they're working on it, portable ways of doing this that are perfect. There's the whole thing of the head, all this stuff. Anyway, so that planted the idea of this film I was already working on, called Dead Girl Vampire Cats. And I spoke to this friend, Luke, about perhaps doing a version of it for the dome, which he explained would have to be stitched together in a very complicated way, because it wasn't shot in 360. And in fact, I shot this whole film with my iPhone and iPad. So that was a whole other thing, anyway, this whole discussion started. So then I got this image of making a space that would be all around you, and that a few people at a time would be able to go into. And I didn't know, I've never done work. I did one installation back when I was a student called Doug and Mike, Mike and Doug, that was about the Starn twins. Some of you might know their work. They were students with me at museum school. That was an installation I did with a couple of old-fashioned monitors and VHS tape and, funky. I built like a hall of mirrors to go in it, but it was funky. This was like a much more complicated idea. So I got help from designers, people I knew. I told what I wanted. There's a guy I was introduced to a guy through the person who does my soundtracks, Bruce Odlin, introduced me to this guy, Max Bernstein, who's a projection designer, and he helped me come up with a kind of design for the inside of this space. And then I realized in order to figure out how to do this in real life, I had to actually do it in kind of workshop forms. So in this summer, in August, in the upstairs of the barn of my house on Cape Cod, I built this thing with a whole team of collaborators and invited people. And just to kind of perfect it myself, to get feedback. I'm doing that again in Brooklyn in January, so that'll be what I'm calling Lab 2. So somehow the idea came to do this immersive thing, and then I'm in the process of doing it to see what works and what doesn't. So for example, the biggest thing I learned was I had 4 people go in at once at first, and it didn't, I realized immediately it had to actually be 1 person at a time. The space is 8 by 8 feet. And for many reasons, it only worked with 1 viewer at a time. And it's 20 minutes long, the experience. So then I had to rethink, how will people see it? It means only 3 people can see it an hour, which I'm okay with. And so anyway, I'm doing it in these workshop forms to perfect it and figure out what works and what doesn't, and how it can be installed in different spaces, and hopefully trying to get a museum home for it, or somewhere where it can actually be, either temporarily. And I designed the whole thing very, very inexpensively and very portably. So the whole thing breaks down into these very light panels, almost like theater flats. Mm-hmm. So it's like a cross between theater and film and tripping on acid, and all the things that most influenced me.
Is there a
in my life.
projector on the ceiling too?
There's a projector, so there's an image on the ceiling, it's rear projection screen, and the projector is projecting rear projection from above. And then there are windows on 3 sides that simulate the windows in the film, some of which you'll see in this first 5 minutes. They were designed sort of to scale after those windows. And the film, this is the background of the film, was I was stuck in this house on Cape Cod for the whole year of 2014. And you guys, if you were in New York, I don't know where you were, but on the Cape, it was a winter of 7 blizzards, which on Cape Cod is very rare. I mean, snow happens and it sort of melts in 2 days because it's by the ocean. This was outrageous. There were like 5 feet of snow on the ground. There were huge drifts. It just snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed. And so we were really stuck in this house, like literally stuck. There was a week where we couldn't get out. I had to snowshoe out to the road. We were running out of food. It was like a whole thing. And I had also experienced in New York City Hurricane Sandy and had some flooding problems in the building I was in. So somehow this idea grew as I was shut into this house all winter. I started picking up my phone when I woke up in the morning and shooting the blizzards outside from bed. I shot a lot of the film from bed. And shooting my cats, 2 cats who were devouring me as I woke. I would wake up and the cats would be on top of me, sort of licking me and sucking on me and doing what they do. They're really attached to me. And the angle of the shots and the light, because it was very, very early in the morning, it made my skin look like a dead person. And it makes the cats look like they're kind of almost like big jungle creatures. So the scale of you'll see this beginning on the tiny screen, but the idea, I'm a romantic dreamer, and I love making films for the big screen, and I still do make films for the big screen or for immersion, even though we're living in a world where I've become an impossible dinosaur, and they'll probably hardly be seen the way I want them to be seen. So anyway, it's a very intimate film. What's really weird about it, and I haven't even processed all of this, is that in a certain sense it's a documentary. It's me, it's my animals. It sort of fits with a whole lifetime of work I've made about people close to me, and family and friends, and now it's pets, pet friends. And it became for me about all the fears that we push into the dark corners of our mind about global warming, climate change. It's absolutely personal and visceral effect on us, even though we really don't want to think about it or admit it. And so that's kind of the larger frame, is what happens when we feel like we're safe, and we do all these things to make ourselves feel safe, and we create a structure in a house that we feel safe in, but in a second, that, as we've just seen with the 2 hurricanes, or many hurricanes that have just destroyed people's homes and lives, like what happens in that split second where you realize, oh my God, I've just gone from thinking I'm safe to being not safe, like that. So that's all the kind of stuff behind the material. So that's a little tiny teaser. It's kind of a horror film, but no.
Very powerful. I wonder, you noticed, you mentioned that you had several people coming to your space experience in it. What was their feedback? How, because it feels that if it's all around you, that it should be very intense.
It's very intense. I mean, people use the word apocalyptic. I mean, it gets really weird. Like it goes into a whole weird, place. My favorite thing was one woman who doesn't drink. I've known her for years. She doesn't drink. She kind of staggered out of it, and she was wandering around my kitchen. And I said, "Can I help you? Are you okay?" And she said, "I need a vodka." I felt kind of guilty about that, but it's in the installation. It's really powerful, and the sound. The walls are actually speakers. What Bruce did for me is the walls are made of foam core, of heavy-duty foam core, and so he implanted these little, who understands sound here, that there's little things that make the walls into the speakers. They're like little round, I forgot what they're called. Anyway, so the speakers are all around you, including underneath you, and the cat's face is enormous, like huge, and so it becomes
like the wall size.
Yeah. It becomes quite intense and frightening, which is exactly what I wanted in a fun way. It's like some people, I think it's in a fun way, but it's terrifying. It's pretty terrifying.
Thank you, Cindy.
You're welcome. So I hope you all get to see the whole.
Yeah, when do you know when?
Well, I'm going to be doing it in Brooklyn, but I just have to figure out. It's the end of January, but I don't know exactly how many days, and then it has to be sort of by appointments. So what I'll probably do is post some things, and people will have to sign up, and whoever signs up first, because I'm going to be very limited, because it's not my space, and it's actually a working studio, so I can't have access to it all the time. So the hope is it'll be somewhere where it can really stay and be seen at some point.
Great. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about your film, the Woody's Order?
Sure.
And how this idea of mixing the play with the documentary came. How did this happen? And just a little bit, explain a little bit of what the film is to the audience.
Sure. Before I start, I loved your work.
Thank you.
I felt like I was on the boat in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Fabulous.
Which, is
one of my favorites.
So just put that out there.
Thank you.
So yeah, Woody's Order is a documentary that my partners and I just premiered at Tribeca. That's where I met Olga. And how it came about is an actress friend of a mutual acquaintance put us together with Ann Talman, and she's an older actress. She premiered on Broadway with Liz Taylor a while back, and she was on Seinfeld and Murphy Brown and bit parts. Seinfeld, I think, if you remember an episode where there's like a sneeze that leads to an affair. She's the woman who's with George, I don't know, Seinfeld fans. And she had written a one-woman play about her life taking care of her brother who has CP, cerebral palsy. And as a result of being his order, which is the title Woody's Order, she sort of gave up on her acting career. And the play is like a very personal telling of her story that deals with, from her brother going off to, special homes as a kid, to the death of both parents, to, it's like a really different kind of story that you hear from someone who takes care of someone who has an illness like that, because it's no whole bar. She's cursing at him, and she's, telling him off. She loves him, but, he's ruining her life. It's just, it's just like a really, interesting play. When we were put together with her, we were going to be commissioned to do, almost like a vanity piece for her. It was like a side gig. And after we read the play, it got the kind of motors running. Wow, this is like really interesting. This could be something a little bit beyond that if she would be willing. And then she told us that she wanted to perform the play for her brother for the first time and wanted us to film that. I was like,
One-on-one, right? There's no other audience.
yeah, no audience. You know, they were going to do it in a theater here in New York, and it was like a holy shit moment. Like, wow. You know, well, first off, his name is Woody. Woody, you know, is a little older than her. He can't talk. He can't verbally communicate. He can't really do anything. He has no use of his hands, his legs. A nurse has to, you know, take him to the bathroom, has to feed him. But there is like a soul in this body that understands, comprehends. He can emote, he can cry, he can laugh.
His reactions were the miracle of this film, I think. You know, how he reacts to everything she's saying.
Yeah. I mean, so then becomes the creative challenge as a filmmaker. You know, how do we make this a documentary? Because it's a play. It's also an event. Something is happening, right? She's doing this performance piece for her brother for the first time. So we're going to be capturing a very real reaction. And we decided, you know, to try and immerse ourselves into the theatrical piece so that while we were capturing his authentic reaction to this play about a very personal, you know, pieces of his life, we were going to capture it so that you weren't watching like a proscenium stage play, but you were like with them, you know, experiencing it with them, as immersive or as VR as, you know, as we could be in the setting. And it became, you know, a very difficult shoot because, for one, he is not equipped to, you know, be a subject for 8 to 10 hours of filming. You know, he has to nap. He, you know, his body can't really maintain that. And she is having, you know, in performing for him, she's emoting emotions that she didn't plan on as an actress. And we're trying to work around all of these kind of moving parts with dollies and, you know, the equipment that we're all sort of used to using to paint our canvas. She also gave us like a storage drive filled with home films of them growing up together, which for filmmakers is like, you know, that's like the whole the arc has just been, you know, opened. And you don't really see home movies from the 50s and the 60s of someone with CP. So we were able to blend the show, the kind of interesting angles and things we were doing to film the show with the home footage and create this, you know, experience. I mean, we had to cut up her play and chop it down to a short film, you know, length. But I think we were all really proud. I mean, we had a few fights with her afterwards about, you know, because this is a very personal thing, what to cut, you know. But Woody really emotes, like he's crying, he's laughing, he's moving in his seat when he's uncomfortable. And it's just like, it was something, I hadn't done anything like that before, you know. I mean, my sort of artistic input into the documentaries is generally dealing with real subjects in real environments and trying to figure out how to make a compelling piece of art. So if we're filming in Lahore, Pakistan, following, you know, a subject who's there. One film I did called The New Recruits had a young business grad who was trying to train a sales force to sell drip water irrigation systems in Pakistan. It was a miserable failure, but it was great for the film. And what we did is, well, how do we make this an interesting story that people can kind of plug into? So we found a dance troupe in Lahore that we commissioned to craft an interpretive dance about the water crisis in Lahore. And we filmed that. And that's maybe the most similar thing I've done to the Woody's Order, but that's how we're trying to keep moving, you know, the line with our films. And it's just sort of exploring, you know, from interpretive dance to, I just, for our most recent film, shot a rap video with like a puppet and dancers and chassids and, you know, whatever we can do to really flex the artistic muscle so that when the audience gets to the film, they're engaging with, you know, the story in a way they're used to when they go to see movies. And that's kind of the rhyme or the reason to what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, so it's really interesting how the author of the play becomes the co-author for you all the directors, right, of this film. And John, I wanted to ask you, in your films with the project Musketeers that you did in Russia that I really love. When you give their cameras to the people with different disabilities and you pair them with the TV, with professionals, TV journalists and filmmakers, and it becomes their story. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this project and how this experiment. I felt their films, you know, they were first-time filmmakers, all of them, but they were so artistic and sincere, and there was this really pure sense to all the films. How did you work with them, and how does, from whom the story is coming affects the genre?
Well, actually, there's one of the filmmakers from Krasnoyarsk has cerebral palsy. Sounds like to the same degree as the protagonist in your film. He's quadriplegic. Everybody thought he was not smart, unexpressive, and one day his mother crafted a sort of beak that she attached to his baseball cap, and he began writing poems on the computer. And whoa!
What, she attached what?
Huh?
She attached what?
She attached like a little beak. You know, the technology is very primitive. She basically made this out of masking tape and taped it onto the bill of his hat, and he began writing poems. She knew it was in there, but nobody knew how to find it. And all of a sudden, he had a way to express himself. He does very good computer animation, and basically directed his own film. With the help, we paired him up with a reporter. Most of the reporters that we have working in local television anyway aren't very artistic, whether it's here or in Russia, and it was sort of a good combination because he helped sensitize this sort of rather straight and conventional reporter into producing something that was very, very emotional and artistic. The nice part about this film is that in addition to making the films and sharing them electronically, the filmmakers traveled to visit each other. So we had a group from New York City that went to 2 cities in Russia, and then the Russians came here. So it was a nice film and inspiring, but we don't have
And they had
good way to
screenings of each other's work, right, in both cities.
Correct.
And then it continued. I remember we had another project with the same organization in the spring, and then new people came and they saw the conversation of the old group in DCTV. So it's like a project that consists on so many layers, and now with different platforms, right?
So the success and this failure in the project, the success is primarily in Russia because the TV stations in Russia became sensitized to the needs of people with disabilities in their community. There had never been, I think in the case of, what we did is in order to embark on the project, the TV stations had to agree to make their station accessible to people with disabilities. And it was the first time people with disabilities had ever been inside the station. And they were accessible, but they were accessible because the wheelchairs were carried into the space. There was sort of like a suicide ramp that they built, but nobody in their right mind would ever want to go down it. But both stations have now ongoing regular programs made by people with disabilities for people with disabilities that deal with disability issues within their community. And it's on every week as programming block in these 2 cities. We don't have anything like that we were able to attach here in New York. And so far, all the places that I've presented this for wider distribution have not bit. So I've got one last sort of trick up my sleeve, which I'm happy to share with you. So we edited this thing down to 39 minutes and a few seconds because that gets it underneath the time limit for a short documentary in the Oscar race.
That's the documentary that documents actually all the process of people making the films and meeting each other, right?
Right. And they made the films, but I sort of supervised, and the documentary material that we had to craft this out of was very imperfect, and we were painted into many, many corners. And so now it's at the point where it's sort of the best it can be. It's not perfect, It has very, very strong emotional moments, and then it's got other parts where it could be better. But it's not bad, and it would certainly be competitive against other films. And every year, within the genre of short documentaries, I would say 75% of the winning documentaries in the past 10 years have dealt with disability issues. So I thought somebody's going to take this because they're going to think at least they've got a shot at competing. But nobody's taken it. So I'm going to take my name off of it. And I'm going to make the filmmakers themselves the director of the film and re-edit it one more time to emphasize the role that they did and let them be the directors and see if it goes further on their shoulders than it did on mine, because I couldn't get it to where I needed it to go.
So it will be co-directed by all their like dozens of people. I see.
Nice, beautiful.
Lynn, I would like to ask you to show me the piece that you brought and tell us about it.
Okay,
The
sure.
title is very intriguing to me.
So I'll just start by talking a little bit about the notion of any attempt to work in reality is an experiment, and that's what keeps us going. We wouldn't step out the door if we knew what was going to happen, and I think that often we step out the door and then we try to walk in somebody else's door and the door gets slammed in our faces because they don't want us there. And also, as you all know, these days people are very cautious about cameras, and we've all seen that change in the last few decades. They know how the camera is equal to some form of surveillance. It's not just a celebration of your life, it's a crash of your privacy, and something could result, maybe something legal, whatever, so that people are a little bit nervous about cameras. And they also own their own cameras, so they're going to shoot back at you and things like that. So I found that one of my answers to that is that when we ask someone to be in our films, they aren't just our subjects, they're actually our collaborators. And maybe I'm just saying here, maybe that's like a little bit of a too clever way to ask people to get involved, to agree to work with you. But to work with you actually might involve something that is a creative impulse from their part. They're not just players on your chessboard anymore, but there's a creative gesture that comes from every direction. So that kind of started actually a few blocks from here, because I decided I wanted to make a film about shift bed apartments in Chinatown, but I didn't know anybody in the shift bed apartments, so I thought, no problem. Someone told me about a senior citizen center on Mott Street. I'll go audition people, and I'll make a sort of fiction film. But when I got there and I auditioned, when you use the word audition, 40 people will show up. And I actually chose, and I'm not used to doing auditions, I'm used to doing interviews. And the interviews gave me a chance to discover that of those 40 people who auditioned, a shift bed is an apartment that you share with people. A lot of different adults live in them. They're also called hotbed houses. It's a way to survive in New York. And I have a whole reason for why I wanted to make that film. But then of the people who auditioned, 7 of them had lived or were currently living in shift bed apartments. So we ended up making a film together, which is called Your Day Is My Night. But we also did live performances in Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, all over the place. We did performances in shelters. We did performances in community centers and colleges, and that performance element of it became part of the film. So there is this kind of maybe surprising flow between the performing of the self and the revealing of the self. The revealing is all part of that history of documentary, but the performance, I thought, gave, what shall I say, empowered people to articulate something about their lives. And also in that particular project, I was dealing a lot with translations because I don't speak Chinese. So I had to work with people who spoke Cantonese and Mandarin. And so as people were telling me the story of their lives, their story of their immigration experience, those stories became, in a sense, part of a script that then I gave back to the people in the film, and they were performing what they'd already told me, but a distillation. So that was the beginning of a hybrid journey that I've taken. And then what I'm going to show you today started off as a live performance in laundromats all over New York. I like to work out of the theater construct. Come back in it, go back out. We've all been talking about that proscenium in a sense, and that rectangle or square or the screen can be disrupted. I think that's maybe something all of us share, is we're trying to work outside the frame in a sense. So it started off as a live performance around laundry work, around the act, the intimacy that comes from laundry work, the closeness, the way that laundry is in a sense an extension of your epidermal layer, but it's in the city, it's often the part that touches someone else. Like, you don't like to touch someone on the subway. If your clothes touch, then people get very uncomfortable, but we're all moving in a realm that's so close. But then we let other people, strangers, wash our clothes. Those strangers start to know more about us, our secrets, than maybe we do or that we want them to. So that piece was called Every Fold Matters. We worked with laundry workers, we worked with actors, and you kind of don't know where one begins and one ends. And now the film version, you're about to see the trailer, is called The Washing Society, because we integrated one historical element. In the late 19th century, precisely in 1881, there was a laundry society in Atlanta of African American women, up to 3,000 of them, who wanted higher wages per pound for what they were doing. So they collectivized, and they actually tried to shut the city down. If people aren't clean, they don't want to go out into the world. And so we were very interested in that idea of that connection between workers and what kind of comes out of that, the energy that comes out of that. So you're just going to see a little bit of that, and that film is named for that group. It's called The Washing Society. So it's the second time that I've moved from a performative realm into the DVD or the single platform way of presenting a documentary, but they're very porous, the two world spaces. So now you're going to see our...
Were the Atlanta women successful?
What?
Were they successful?
The
Atlanta women?
They were, yeah, they were. And actually, in the real film, this is another break between the subjects and like the history and the performance. One of the women who's an actor in our film discovered as we were making the film that her grandmother had been a washerwoman for 30 years in New York City, and she actually fought the bosses and won, and that's in the film. So that's one of the amazing things that happen. Like, every time you think this is the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life, we don't have any stories, no laundry workers want to talk to us because of immigration issues for the most part, or because their bosses don't, so many reasons. Then you turn to something like your alternative, because you say, I'm an experimental filmmaker. If I can't get people to talk to me, I'll make it up. And then they end up having the stories themselves, and it just happens by kind of strange kismet. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, they got a higher rate per pound. So I guess you'd say they were successful. But this was during that brief moment of freedom after the Civil War, and then we get Jim Crow and things got really, really messed up. So it was a great moment. I'll just tell you this, so we just did the color grading and sound mix for this film too. This is what you're going to see is before the color grading. But our premiere is going to be in Charlottesville, Virginia, at a celebration of the book that we learned, where we learned about the the Washing Society. It's going to be an event around Black women and freedom. So we're pretty excited about that.
On a normal day, on a normal 9-hour day, I do myself no less than 25 to 26 bags. I think that I fold over 1,000 pieces of clothes a day. And you know, just little articles, socks, you know, underwear. All of them have to be turned inside out one by one. Every piece counts.
我喺呢度做咗差唔多，應該都做咗都有16年㗎啦。多咗好多啲代洗啊、drop off 啊，同埋以前就通常佢都係你自己嚟洗嘅嘢，變咗好多咯。
I think about other things when I'm doing it. My mind wanders.
All you get is their name and their bag of dirty stuff. You write it on a tag for all that sweat, coffee, period stains, and whatever.
Atlanta, July 1881. 20 African American laundresses meet to form the Washing Society. They demand respect and control over their work. They go door to door asking other laundresses across the city to join their strike. In 3 weeks, the Washing Society grows from 20 to 3,000 strikers.
Sí, él es el dueño de muchos lugares. Siempre viene a ver, verifica el dinero, la máquina, hace llamadas, tú sabes. A veces viene su esposa. Ella también lo está velando todo. Yo no digo nada. Me lo reservo para el otro. Nos dejan quietas la mayoría del tiempo. Mientras hagamos nuestro trabajo, nos dejan quietas.
咁你話拍乜嘢啊 ？documentary。
So the chorus of the voices at the end, there you have several voices, right? One over the other. It's going to be one of their elements in the film also, the technique that you use?
Oh yeah, so the film has Chinese, Spanish, and English, and sometimes we translate and sometimes we don't. I really wanted, I've been thinking about translation for a long time, and I get upset when I think people become too dependent on subtitles, and they actually stop listening to the texture of the voice, maybe you say the drama of the voice. So I want to create some alienation on the part of the listener. We end up integrating in the performance part that what you missed before, but you don't even have to know that. I want there to be that sense of the people who are speaking, who are ostensibly outsiders in the American world, also have their own inside, and you're the outsider. So we play with that a lot. I mean, you actually have Chinese and Spanish together. I guess you maybe have to recognize those languages a teeny bit. So that's a big part of the weave.
Are we going to see the washing machine from inside?
Oh, from inside. No, we don't have a camera inside, but you do see quite a lot of spinning and things like that.
Lucy,
yes.
I wanted to ask you about, would you like to show?
Well, I could. How are we doing? Actually, this is my son is a film that was finished in 2006, and and one of the challenges that I was dealing with was animation. At that time, we were talking about hybrid medias. That's one of the subjects we're talking about.
Yeah.
And at that time, I found no models whatsoever. I mean, I had the idea, it was late 90s, and so I had to invent. But now it's quite commonplace. And but it's a film about an artist. And the thing I wanted to break through was, most films about artists I call them illustrated lectures, and it's so tiresome. The image, the voice, the image, the voice. And so I wanted to use her art as the aesthetic for making a narrative, to make it for the narrative, for the storytelling. So I'm just going to show the opening. I think if you can stand up to 8 minutes, I think you'll get the idea of what I was trying to do.
In front of the Academy of Art. She's the only woman in the crowd. She is bright and happy and optimistic. As a painter and member of the Russian avant-garde, she has committed herself heart and soul to the revolution. She must still believe that it will bring great prosperity for its people and unsurpassed creativity for its artists. Born in 1886 in Tsarist Russia, Aunt Sonia came from a wealthy, conventional Jewish merchant family who were privileged enough to live in St. Petersburg. She spent most of her life in the same city with 3 names: St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and Leningrad. She was my grandmother's sister, and known to us as the sister who broke all the rules. With Glasnost and the end of the Cold War, when we felt free to seek out relatives in both St. Petersburg and Moscow, Sonia's granddaughter, Marina Shalivskaya, gave me many photographs of Sonia's paintings and her memoirs. Sonia started writing them in the late 1940s while Stalin was still alive, and it was still unsafe to praise an earlier and freer time. And she continued through the 1950s with the gradual thaw that Khrushchev allowed. Nevertheless, she always had to be circumspect about what she wrote. I wanted to hear Sonia tell her own story, yet I also wanted to find out what she could not tell us, and what she really wanted us to understand about her life, art, and the times in which she lived.
Underground activities, student strikes, everything was giving people the dream of a new life, calling woman to the fight for her rights as a person and citizen. High education, professional and full independence became, for the Russian woman of that time, the aim of her existence. At the age of 19, I went to study in Switzerland, in the town of Bern, where I was admitted to the medical faculty of Bern University. That was just a temporary time of my life. My real way of the artist became clear just a little later.
Our Russian emigre cousin, Alexei Dimshitz, told my father and myself this story about Aunt Sonia.
Софья. Она была очень способным художником. She was a very good artist, but she had never studied any place. And she spent most of her time traveling. Once she found herself in Bern in Switzerland, and there she met a political emigre named Roosevelt. Had he come back to Russia, they would have put him in Siberia. Sonia fell in love with him as a hero, and she decided to marry him. She came to Petersburg with the parents, and she said, I am going to marry this Roosevelt. Grandfather said, who is this Roosevelt? She said, he's a political emigre.
Что?
He said, what? Political emigre? And yet, he'll wind up in jail. Absolutely not. Then Sonia's made a scandal. I'll go hang myself. That grandma said to grandfather, Isaac, this is your daughter. You're not going to live with Roosevelt. She'll live with Roosevelt. Let them go get married. Then there was a cortege to Bern, to the wedding. This was 1905, well before the revolution. Then Sonia had temperamental differences with Roosevelt.
And she ran away from Rosenfeld to Dresden to her brother Uncle Lev, a student revolutionary eluding the Tsar's police. In Dresden, she met Count Alexei Tolstoy, a distant relative of the writer Leo Tolstoy.
She was beautiful. He was an interesting man, and they loved each other.
Right, and you mentioned that when we were talking that when you were going to make their animation, at the time you realized that was
it was the late 90s, and I was working on a copy stand, and I was there, and then all of a sudden we had Final Cut, love it, and After Effects, and Adobe and Photoshop, and then everything became possible. Yeah, and also I worked with some great people. I found some great.
But at the time you were discovering animation, and there weren't many in the films.
No,
right?
I was looking for models. I had this idea of what I wanted to do. It was that original collage. They sort of gave me the idea, and then you sort of see it throughout. Yeah, there was absolutely nothing. It was just incredible, and now it's very commonly used in documentaries, and really nicely. I think I've seen a lot of.
I think I'd like to ask all of you one last question, like two questions. One is, do you consider yourself a documentary filmmaker, considering all the different stuff that each of you are doing? What are the main challenges in your work? Because so many, I've seen some of the VR pieces, for example, and we discussed it with Kira before, that why do they have to be in VR? I don't get it. Sometimes it's just, you're watching everything around you, but why do you need to look on the other side? And I was thinking, well, the space for me in this experience has to be the character of the conception, for example. And I'm sure you have, in all of these different genres, you have challenges that you think, how do I prove that that's the genre that it should be in? So we can just start from this side. Kira.
Documentary filmmaker. Sometimes I feel like one. Sometimes I feel like a documentary filmmaker, and sometimes I don't. I think the form that I'm working in doesn't really exist. I don't know what to call it. I was recently writing an application for something, and they were like, how would you describe this experience? Like, what category? And I was like, I can't put it in a category. I don't think that category exists, and I feel like we've all, like, Lucy, as you're talking about the animation that you were trying, like, it didn't exist, like, what was in your mind, and Final Cut wasn't out yet. Like, you're coming up with something and the tool hasn't been invented yet.
And
you had the idea, but you didn't know how to make it, and you're, creating these panels in your attic and like embedding the sound into them because you don't have a dome in your house. So
Sadly,
you have to make one. Yet. That'll be next. And you're coming up with these camera techniques like to create the visual style that you want in order to capture the intimacy and the challenges of like doing something that's maybe coming from a narrative approach but in a documentary format. And Lynn, you're using performance, like your process still amazes me and like constantly seems like it's evolving on itself. Like I feel like probably, and this is maybe a question we can have after, but the way that I feel like you've been developing this process between like filmmaking and theater and this kind of dance between the two of them, and like now I feel like you've distilled it in this process, but coming from where you were with My Day Is Your Night, to me it's like I think the form is evolving. We're all taking different approaches on that form, and sometimes I think that's documentary and sometimes I think it's something else. And in terms of VR, I don't think everything should be VR. Definitely not. I think things can be very strong when they're framed. Like, I don't think Woody's Order could be VR. While it could be interesting to be between them and close to them, you won't get the expression on his face and feel that emotion unless you are in a tight frame. And that, to me, has to be a two-dimensional format.
Yeah, Cindy?
Yeah, I feel like more and more I hate the labels. And all of us, you picked an interesting group because obviously you could have picked a number of people who really make documentaries, like more straight documentaries. But for me, I feel that my films generally, as a body of work, are more personal essays in a way, and some of them are called documentaries, and when they're distributed, they're called documentaries, but they're all very personal in nature, so they're not like traditional documentaries ever. I mean, they all have different filming formats, they all have different kinds of elaborate animation, and so no, I consider myself an artist, and I work in the medium, whatever idea I come up with kind of calls me to a different form. So when I'm working on something that's sort of a documentary, yeah, I guess I feel like a documentary filmmaker, but like right now I find this thing I'm working on now, I don't even know where to call, it has documentary elements, it's experimental, but it's not in some ways it doesn't fit in a whole experimental program really. So yeah, I think the labels, it's like that thing like...
They're not helpful.
They're not helpful. It's sort of like sexuality. Like if you're a woman and you sleep with a woman, does that mean you're a lesbian? I mean, I don't know. There's a way that it all should be much more fluid, I think, in art forms and in everything. And I don't like the categorization of things.
What's your biggest challenge in this work?
Well, in this work, the biggest challenge is for the film. It's two answers for the film and the installation. Well, in both senses, it's how to get it out in the world, because I'm used to having the two long form films I made were in theaters, and I had distributors for them. And with a short film, I don't really know how to. I really want it to be seen on a big screen. I don't really know how to get it into the world. The same is true with the installation. And is how to get it out. But the bigger challenge for me with the installation is that I had to, once I was in the space and was faced with, it felt like almost like being put inside a hologram, because suddenly a lot of the shots that work in the film don't work in the installation. The timing is totally different when you're surrounded by something and when it's blown up. So I had to I've been having to reconstruct it spatially in sort of time and space in a way that I've never done before, and it's both incredibly exciting and incredibly challenging, because it really changes your whole frame. It's completely different from linear editing. Yeah, it's the same thing that happens, I think, with VR. Yeah.
Jeremy.
My two partners and I, Dan, Seth, and I, we kind of each wear different hats. We all three direct and produce, but Dan is the writer and Seth is the editor, and just by not having a secondary title, they started calling me the art director. So this film I did, Evocateur, the Morton Downey Jr. movie, it was at Tribeca and it was on CNN in, I think, 2010. We had all this great footage of this talk show host from the 80s who was like a Trump before Trump, and he, fist fights over politics on his talk show, and he's chain smoking cigarettes. And everyone we interviewed, who are like, people who were talk show hosts in the 80s, like Richard Bay, you know, someone like that, or even Pat Buchanan, the conservative, you know, firebrand. They told these wild behind-the-scenes stories that are not reflected in the footage, or there's no photos of. And part of the fun of being like the art director is to kind of climb into the subject matter and say, okay, well, how can we artistically cover these great stories in a way that makes you feel like you're back in the 80s by time machine and you're living the moment with him. I think I'd seen Waltz with Bashir, and I had the benefit at that time that there were animation films that were coming out, right? So I decided, you know, what if we climbed into that kind of like 80s animation style of like Heavy Metal or The Wall, and recreated these moments in his life with that sort of hand-drawn animation style that's like, you know, there's nudity and it's rock and roll, and we'll make those moments of his life come to life. So I found, just by like Googling, this British animator, you know, who was doing like for Rolling Stones concerts, the shtick they put on the, you know, the big screen. It would be like a nude woman writhing on a giant tongue, you know, as their band is playing. And I was like, he's the guy, right? He's perfect. So, you know, we started with a story that one of Morton Downey's producers told, where he's looking at a Time magazine with his father on the cover, and his father was like a famous Irish crooner, and he got so angry that his father was on the cover and he's not, that he like tore it to shreds. This is the story the guy's telling. So in our animation, you see him, you know, looking at it, he's smoking, and then he turns into a bull and charges the red Time cover, and it turns into like pieces. But that's like the room that we were given by this sort of animation, you know, the room to kind of storytell and climb into place. So I bring it up because it's, you know, I feel like a documentary filmmaker for sure. That's kind of what I've chosen to do. Yeah. But I feel like we're also, you know, just at the base, we're storytelling. And that's that added hat, and whether it's with VR or experimental or, you know, all of the great art that you're seeing and hearing from my colleagues here, it's kind of exploring how to tell a story in a fun and unique way that the audience, the most important part of our films is the audience, because we need them to see it.
Sure.
So,
thank you, Jeremy.
So I guess I would say in this setting that yes, I do identify with documentary, because I think documentary is different from narrative film because we don't have control. And our goal is to allow for a more porous creative space where things that come in are not what we expected, and that we go into situations and we're not always able to manipulate them just as the script told us to. That's why most of us would find the notion of someone giving us a script, and they say a film that follows a script is good, is because it successfully followed the script. That probably doesn't interest any of us. We need surprises. That's the kind of people we are. So in that sense, I think we have to work with the document and come up with creative, inventive ways to deal with it, so that the hermetic, not to put down narrative films, but I think certain kind of commercial narrative films exist in the notion of a hermetic space. We're going to recreate the 1950s, or we're going to go into a sci-fi space, but it's all in. It could be in a recording studio. It could be in some kind of backlot in Hollywood, and that's the reason they go to backlots, is because of control. So in that sense, I think I am a documentary filmmaker.
John, I wanted to ask you, besides that question, was to tell us a little bit about your latest film, Cuba and the Cameraman, that just premiered at Venice Film Festival, which I haven't seen yet, and I'm wondering how, you know, I've heard that it's 25 years of filming in the film.
That's it?
Is it?
No, it's actually 45.
Oh, 45?
It started in 1972.
So, and what is the technique that you use to bring it all in one film, and what are your responses to their filmmakers, the work you've seen here today, and all these genres?
So, well, you're talking about labels. I would say that makes me the world's slowest filmmaker. And so, 45. You have one that's more than 45 years? Come on.
No, you're
I win.
You win, but barely.
I win.
Yeah, barely.
It's like that scene in Jaws where they're showing their scars.
It's not a contest, anyone wants to win.
Yeah. But I love time.
And time's a really important variable. It's a variable that we all understand the importance of in our work. Access is the other important variable, and we're seeing different varieties of access and ways of dealing with creative ways of dealing with lack of access in order to fill in the blanks. We've heard many different examples of that, but the overriding third variable is our passion, because it's really hard to do this type of work. It's really hard to be a documentary filmmaker. You start out every morning with zero, and you're scratching to try to move your way a little bit up the mountain. And no matter what your last film was, and no matter how successful that may, you're starting again at zero the next day. There are a couple of trust fund filmmakers out there, but I don't think any of us are in that group. So this film started in 1972. It concentrates on following three families in Fidel for 45 years. And I had access to all of them, which makes the film quite unusual. And even at one point when the Cubans were sort of shutting me down because they were angry at me because they thought that I stopped the Mariel Bay boat lift, they couldn't stop me from seeing my friends. And so I might not have access to some of the main news events that I was, traditionally covering, but I always had access to my friends, and I continued to figure out how to get access to Fidel. And I think the other problem that we talk about is distribution. Distribution is a really big problem for all of us. And this film is going to be on Netflix. It's the first time we've ever worked with Netflix. I hope it won't be the last time.
Was it produced by, when did they come on board?
So I've been trying to find somebody who was interested in working with us and wasn't successful. Who's competed for ITVS funding? Have any of you guys tried to get ITVS funding?
Try.
Successful?
No.
No. So welcome to the club, and it's to some degree it's a humiliating process. With a bunch of people with blue hair out in San Francisco telling you how you should make your movies, and you get so close. See, it's like, I'm mixing my metaphors, but they're Lucy holding the football, and you think you're going to finally get there, and whoosh, they yank it away. And encourage you to try again next year.
After you put in a lot of hours.
6 times.
Yes. And try again. So I went the ITVS route. Had it greenlit at HBO, and Sheila, bless her heart, who has enabled us to do many things, she like kisses you one day, she crushes you the next. This was the days we were getting crushed, and tried 3 times because we were very happily married to HBO, wanted HBO to take this film and just couldn't succeed. So for you guys, the Netflix experience was, I've never had an experience like that before. I don't know anybody. We haven't been dating anybody for 30 years. It's only been HBO. And don't know how to talk to other people, don't have agents, and it was a performance. I had to present this film to a dark room full of 30 people who I didn't know in Los Angeles, and that was to sort of make or break.
They all work for Netflix?
The Netflix people. Yeah.
And it was at what stage, a rough cut or real? Or?
I wanted to make it look a little rougher than it was. We had been like trying to get this thing into an assemblage and really hadn't. And I think that was one of the problems with it being accepted, because there was so much material over 45 years that I know we, at that point, weren't successful in really telling the story properly. So I re-roughed it so that it seemed like there was more work to do and that they could like
they could contribute.
They could contribute, yes. And I practiced. We got everybody from DCTV together and showed this, and I went through the presentation. And then got to Los Angeles a day early and went to bed at 8 o'clock at night, and got up and got to Netflix an hour before I was supposed to. So it was a real performance. And I didn't know whether I had succeeded or not. And then a week later, they called and said they were interested. What's interesting about Netflix for everybody is that I always think that if I make something into a bargain, that it's going to increase the possibility of somebody accepting it. So when they wondered how much our budget was, I handed in a 15-cent budget to figure, wow, we're going to have to get this. And luckily, Matt O'Neill, who was co-directing a lot of the films with me, said, John, don't do this. I said, well, why not? I want them to take it, and this is my last chance to tell the story. And he said, that's not how they operate. They are interested in you because they think you're an artist and they want to be able to fund your vision, which is almost word for word what they said later on in the process. So every time he would do the budget, I would scratch off like half the money and tell him that he couldn't send that in. And he kept fighting me until finally he handed in a proper budget, which they accepted. And thank goodness, because it took a long time in the editing room to be able to compress these 45 years. We were dealing with a lot of archival material. In the next room here, we have the DCTV archives, which is the few tapes that survived the great DCTV flood. This involves Russians, and so I'll tell the story, but I'll shut up. We had the tape library located in the back room on the second floor, and a previous tenant here, in order to get revenge on the city for kicking him out, had chopped up 7 of the 8 remaining fire poles in the firehouse and stuffed them down the storm drains. And 5 years later, the storm drains silted up, and there was a spring rainstorm with 4 feet of standing water on the roof over our tape library. So we're terrified, and we call up emergency plumbers, us, and this Russian grandfather and his son, both about this smart, come to save us. And we do, and they got all their tools. They wheel the tools, and we hear, they knocked a gigantic hole in the pipe, but not before they drained the water. And so all of a sudden we see the 2 of these guys motoring across the second floor with this tidal wave. It's like the Ten Commandments movie, with the Red Sea closing in on them, with all our tapes, every single tape that we'd ever shot, floating away. Wow. So the survivors of that are in that room, and a lot of them is this early Cuban footage, and we never would have been able to restore any of them if we didn't have the budget.
The good budget.
Oh, so they really invested money in the film. It's not just distribution.
Yeah. We worked on it. We were in the editing room for a year.
Oh, it's fabulous.
So 25th of November on Netflix.
How are their notes?
The notes were very sweet, and they would say, well, that part at the end, you want to think about changing that a little bit. I'm not used to that because I've been working with Sheila for the past 35 years, and Sheila just comes in and she goes like this, boom, and you're like and you try to figure out like how you're going to even walk into the editing room. And their points were well taken, and we made some adjustments based on that. But when I finally said, you know what, I'm not comfortable making these last things that you want me to do, they said, oh, okay. And I'm I'm not used to it.
Yeah.
So let's see what happens. The problem with Netflix this year is Netflix has a lot of really, really good documentaries that they're promoting. And so it's really a question of too many kids at the table. We all want all the best resources to be devoted to the publicity and the Oscar campaigns and stuff like that. And they've spread themselves really thin because they've basically gone out and built a lot of interesting movies.
Thank you, John. Lucy, what are your conclusions of today's discussion?
I'll try to wrap this up. First of all, I just want to go back to clarity for a minute. I've often wondered, talk about the idea without the, and the equipment. A heavy camera on those icebergs. I mean, how did he do it? He had. I mean, Fleury's image of filmmaking was much more, verite. And he would have liked it to be, and more intimate. And I don't know, but I think that was the image. But to deal with, I'm sure there's been lots written about it. The heavy camera on the iceberg. I don't quite know how he did it. But yeah, I do intensely consider myself a documentary filmmaker, and I love documents. I love primary source material. And my next film is going to be totally that, I hope. I don't like the talking heads. And my next film is going to be about my uncle, Andre Castellanets, who was an orchestra conductor who, at my time, was like a household name. Now no one here knows about him. My time. We were 6 in the 1970s. And I'm going to see if I can do it just totally with found. I love found material, and I love home movies, and I like the old newsreels, and I just, it's very beautiful to me, and very true, and I like it when it's not processed. Like that's what's so nice about home movies, they're very spontaneous, and people who are just talking to the family camera, and I kind of love all that kind of thing. So I'm intensely documentary.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you everyone for coming, thank you for this wonderful discussion, and welcome to the Russian Film Festival that's still going on till today's evening.